The sky stretched wide over the dusty plains of Redwater Ridge, its pale morning glow washing over the endless fields like a quiet blessing. But for rancher Colt Harland, blessings had been in short supply lately. Trouble had followed him like a shadow, bad harvests, dying cattle, debts piling so high they felt like a wall he could never climb. Yet nothing prepared him for the moment that would shake him to the core, the moment when a trembling voice whispered from behind him, "Don't look down there. That's off limits." It was the kind of warning that hits the air like a shudder, the kind that tells a man his life is about to split into a before and an after, and Colt looked anyway. What he saw made his heart stop, made his jaw clench, and pushed him into doing something he would regret for the rest of his life. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of human empathy, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Soul Call Stories so we can keep bringing you powerful tales like this. Colt Harland wasn't the reckless type. He was a man shaped by land and weather, by years of sweat, grit, and stubborn hope. His ranch sat at the edge of Redwater Canyon, a place where the rocks dipped low and the wind whispered secrets between the cedar trees. It had once been a thriving place, full of laughter from his late wife Miriam and the small dreams they'd raised together before illness tore her away too soon. After she passed, the ranch grew quiet, and so did Colt. He worked without rest, without pause, trying to fill the silence with the sound of cattle hooves, fences being repaired, and the occasional guitar note when he felt brave enough to remember who he used to be. But as the years dragged on, drought struck, diseases spread through the cattle, and Colt's luck fell apart like old wood left too long in the rain. By the time autumn crept over the hills that year, he was on the verge of losing everything. He owed money to lenders who no longer pretended to be friendly, and each sunrise felt less like a gift and more like a reminder that the clock was running out. Then came Tamsin Reddick, a young woman who had arrived in Redwater Ridge just a month earlier. She was quiet, sharp-eyed, and seemed to carry a heaviness in her posture that revealed nothing but hinted at everything. She needed work. Colt needed help. It was simple enough. She moved into the small caretaker cabin near the edge of the canyon, where the land dipped into a narrow gorge filled with scrub and old mining shafts. She kept to herself mostly, but she worked hard, cleaned the barns, tended the sick calves, and insisted she didn't mind the long hours. Colt respected her privacy. After all, everyone had their own ghosts, but there was one place she warned him never to go, a fenced-off corner behind the caretaker cabin, hidden by a shed and tangled brush. She mentioned it once, her voice shaking slightly as she said the words, "Don't look down there. That's off limits." Colt hadn't thought much of it at the time. He figured she had personal belongings there, or maybe the land was unstable. He had no reason to pry, until the morning that changed everything. It started with a scream, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the quiet dawn like a blade. Colt had been loading hay bales onto a cart when the sound echoed from behind the cabin. At first he froze, unsure if it came from a coyote or something else. But then he heard it again, a desperate, broken sound that pulled at something deep inside him. Colt dropped the bale, dust rising around his boots, and hurried toward the caretaker cabin. As he approached, he saw Tamsin rushing from the shed, her face pale, her hands trembling as she tried to block his path. She begged him not to go farther. She repeated her old warning with tears in her eyes. "Don't look down there. That's off limits." But fear had already crawled up Colt's spine, and instinct overrode caution. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and so he stepped around her shaking form, pushed past the brush, and reached the edge of the fenced-off area. What he saw hit him like a sledgehammer. A narrow pit descended into the earth, a forgotten shaft from the mining days, but that wasn't what made him recoil. At the bottom, in the dim half-light that filtered through the broken boards covering the opening, he saw a small, motionless figure. A child, a boy, no older than 7 or 8. His clothes were dirty, torn, his hair matted as if he had been down there for days, maybe longer, and the worst part, the part that made Colt's breath stop, was the faint rise and fall of the boy's chest. He was alive, barely, Colt spun toward Tamsin, his heart hammering. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She wasn't the monster he had assumed in that split second. She wasn't calm or cold or cruel. She looked shattered, consumed by guilt and fear. Colt realized instantly that whatever had happened here had devastated her long before he arrived. For a moment, Colt didn't know what to do. His mind raced. His instincts, sharpened by years of survival, screamed at him to call for help, to notify the sheriff, to get the boy medical attention. But another instinct whispered something darker, colder, and far more dangerous. If word got out that a child had been found injured on his land, authorities would swarm the ranch, and everything he owned could be seized or shut down during the investigation. He wasn't sure he could survive that blow. He wasn't sure the ranch could either. His life, already cracking at the edges, could entirely collapse. And that was when Colt Harland, normally a man of principle, a man who never crossed ethical lines, made the horrifying choice that would haunt him forever. Instead of climbing down to rescue the boy immediately, instead of calling the sheriff, he panicked. Pure, selfish fear flooded him. He covered the shaft again. He turned away. He told himself he needed time to think, that he'd return later, that he wasn't abandoning the child, just protecting himself for a moment. But a moment was too long. Hours passed. Guilt ate at him like acid, but pride and fear fought back hard. Tamsin didn't leave the cabin. She sat on the steps, arms wrapped around her knees, crying silently as the wind rustled through the cedar trees. Colt worked in the yard, trying to pretend he didn't hear the faint whimper rising from beneath the earth whenever the wind hushed enough for the sound to reach him. He tried to bury himself in chores, but every small noise felt like a reminder, every shadow like a condemnation. By noon the sun had reached its peak, shining harshly over the canyon. Colt's hands shook as he tried to mend a fence post. Sweat dripped down his forehead, not from heat, but from the unbearable weight crushing him. He saw Miriam in every glare of light, every flicker of memory, the way she used to remind him that doing the right thing wasn't optional, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Finally, at the breaking point, Colt stumbled back toward the caretaker cabin. He found Tams, sitting exactly where she'd been all morning, her eyes red and swollen. She confessed everything in a long, trembling rush. The child was her younger brother, Reese, who had disappeared days before they arrived in Redwater Ridge. Their stepfather, a violent man who had terrorized them for years, had kidnapped Reese and hidden him in that abandoned shaft before Tamsin managed to escape with him. She found him barely alive, but she was terrified to seek help, afraid authorities would take him away or return them to their abuser. She had only intended to hide him for a day or two until she figured out their next move. But Reese's condition worsened, and she panicked. She begged Colt to forgive her secrecy, to help her now, to save her brother before it was too late. Colt felt sick. The weight of what he had done, what he had failed to do, crushed him until he nearly fell to his knees. He had wasted precious time a child didn't have. Determination replaced fear. With a surge of resolve, Colt tore open the covering over the shaft and descended using a frayed rope he found by the shed. The air down there was thick with dust and despair. He reached Reese, who was barely conscious, his small body weak and trembling. Colt lifted him gently, feeling how fragile he was, and carried him slowly upward, the rope scraping his palms raw. When he reached the surface, Tamsin was waiting with shaking hands. They rushed Reese to Colt's truck and tore down the dirt road toward Redwater Clinic, dust billowing behind them. Colt drove faster than he ever had, his heart pounding with every mile. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. All that mattered was saving that boy. Reese was admitted in critical condition. The doctors worked tirelessly, and Colt paced the corridor like a wounded animal, guilt gnawing at every breath he took. Tamsin sat curled in a chair, silent, exhausted, and terrified. Hours later, the doctor emerged with cautious hope. Reese would survive. He was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but he would recover with time and care. Relief washed over Colt so hard he nearly collapsed. Tamsin covered her face with her hands and wept, this time with gratitude instead of fear. But for Colt, relief didn't erase the shame. He had to face what he had almost allowed to happen. He had to face himself. As the sun dipped behind the clinic's western windows, Colt stepped outside into the fading light and stared at the quiet ranch land stretching beyond the town border. The place he had tried so hard to protect, the land he loved more than he ever admitted, had nearly become the burial ground of a child because he had hesitated in fear. And in that moment, he understood something deeper than regret. He knew that losing the ranch would never have compared to losing his soul. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Soul Call Stories to help us continue creating meaningful tales for people who need them. Special request: comment "Second chances matter." If the message of this story reached you today, in the days that followed, Colt worked with authorities to ensure Tamsin and Reese received protection from their abusive stepfather. The community, upon learning the truth, rallied behind them. And though Colt still faced financial struggles, new opportunities emerged, neighbors offering help, friends stepping in, and the quiet warmth of forgiveness helping him rebuild himself from the inside out. The ranch didn't just survive, it slowly began to heal, just like the people who lived on it. Colt Harland would never forget the moment he looked down into that shaft. It became the turning point of his life, the moment he learned that the right choice often requires courage, sacrifice, and facing the darkest parts of yourself. And sometimes, when a man chooses compassion over fear, he saves more than just someone else's life. He saves his own.